You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics this evening because we have as our guest Pat Collins, who kind of functions in that intersection between law and politics and public corruption. He was the guy who put away George Ryan, Governor George Ryan. But more accurately, he was the lead prosecutor on a team of attorneys from the U.S. Attorney's Office that tried and convicted Governor George Ryan. I think that trial was a 6-month trial in 2006, right? That's
correct.
So some notoriety there, but it wasn't just that trial. 20 cases tried in the U.S. Attorney's Office when he was an assistant U.S. attorney. 20 cases tried to conclusion, to verdict, convictions reached in all, right?
Yes.
20-0, perfect record?
So far.
All right, and as I said, he was there in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 12 years. He, the last 4 years, headed up a public corruption unit under U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald.
That's correct.
And then 8 years of the last 12 years was devoted to Operation Safe Roads?
Among others, but yes, that was a principal activity of mine.
He's now a partner at Perkins, Seattle-based firm, about 800 attorneys, 13, 15 offices, I can't keep track. But he heads up the white-collar criminal defense practice at the Chicago office of Perkins Coie. That's Patrick Collins heads that office up, has done so for more than the last two years. And Perkins Coie, an international firm, I guess offices in Shanghai, offices elsewhere outside the U.S.
Shanghai, I think, is our only place outside the U.S., so if that makes us international, we have a few people in Shanghai.
But Los Angeles and San Francisco and Denver and D.C., no New York office yet.
No New York office yet.
So Patrick Collins, he was chairman of the Illinois Reform Commission. The 4 legislative leaders, Speaker Mike Madigan, Senate President John Cullerton, the 2 leaders of the Democratic side on the House and the Senate, and then the Republicans, minority leaders, Cross and Radonio. It is said that they have a slush fund of $25 million to elect members to the State House and Senate. Is that an accurate statement?
I don't know if they've ever said they have a slush fund.
No, it is said.
It is said.
Would you say that they have a slush fund of $25 million to elect people, and it's going to be unlimited because, well, you can tell us why, but do they have a slush fund of $25 million?
And again, slush fund's obviously a pejorative term. They clearly have a fund to elect the people that they want to elect. If you want to call that a slush fund, that's a pejorative term.
Does that number sound right? Total up to about $25 million in an election year?
Again, I honestly don't know the specific numbers. They have millions and millions of dollars.
AP has said this, and we'll assume they got it reasonably accurate.
Again, I don't know the specific number, but they have a lot of money to elect people of their party.
Yeah, and how do they do it? When you say to elect, you know something about politics now. In a sense, you become a student of politics while in the U.S. Attorney's Office, would you say? Would that be fair to say?
I think that is a fair statement, yes.
Yeah, and so you know something about how people get elected. Money's important, right?
Money's the mother's milk, and I think it's way too important if you talk about it just from a pure sort of policy standpoint. And to talk about the Illinois Reform Commission, which you mentioned, we had a woman named Joan Krupa come and testify. She was a House candidate for the State House in Peoria. There was over $1 million of outside money that came into her race from both sides of the aisle. And I think it fundamentally altered the dynamics of the race. It was in the form of, direct mail pieces. It was in the form of staffers. It was in the form of, outside help. I'm not sure TV ads potentially too. A ton of money came from Minority Leader Cross's operation, and a ton of money came from Speaker Madigan's operation. And I think it fundamentally altered, and Ms. Krupa testified, it fundamentally distorted the race. And I think that's a big problem in politics, is the amount of money.
But maybe the big problem, getting ahead of ourselves, is that there's a lot of prizes in government, and the people who work in government have the power to give out those prizes. So those offices are very valuable. And the Speaker wants to have Speaker Mike Madigan he's been Speaker now for most of the last 3 decades, right?
I think
he took 2 years office, people said, for a coffee break in 95 and 96. So he's easily the most powerful politician in the state of Illinois. You agree?
I do agree.
Yeah, certainly in the Democratic Party, but in the state of Illinois. his power comes from the fact that he's a speaker and he can push legislation through because people want to listen to him if they're Democrats. They don't always listen. They don't all listen. But you don't want to have Mike Madigan upset and one of your enemies, right? Especially if you're in the Democratic Party.
Sure, that's fair.
All right, so he's got all this power and he's got the money to get these folks elected, but the money comes to him because corporations, unions, individuals want to have influence in politics. They know Mike wants money, Speaker Mike, so they give him money and they get influence. That's the way politics works. And you seem to be standing up there and saying from the U.S. Attorney's Office, no quid pro quos. You can do all that stuff, but don't do a quid pro quo. Did I get that right?
Well, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, again, Speaker Madigan and Minority Leader Cross certainly are entitled to raise money, and they're entitled to raise money from their respective constituents. I mean, the Democrats raise a lot of money from unions, trial lawyers. You know, the Republicans raise a lot of money from insurance companies and those constituents of theirs.
And that's fine. That's legal.
I mean, it's legal, and it's part of the American way.
And you're not going to try to stop that as an assistant U.S. attorney or as a private citizen.
And Jeff, of course, I'm a couple years removed from that, and I'm, you know, so I'm not trying to stop anything now. I'm just doing my job at Perkins Coie. But
if somebody offered you to become U.S. attorney, you'd take that badge back in a heartbeat, right?
You know, I love my job right now. Pat Fitzgerald is a close friend. I'm not a politician, but I'm going to avoid that question because that's a great job, of course. But Pat's doing a great job.
Well, he might tire of it at some point. He's been
I don't
there.
know.
It's unprecedented to stay over into a third administration, isn't it?
I'm not a student of...
Well, you know generally about U.S. attorneys. They come in with the president, and even when Clinton changed, even when Clinton had it for 2 terms, I think he asked for resignations from all the U.S. attorneys for the second term of his administration. Here's a case where another president has come in of a different party, Patrick Fitzgerald, appointed by George Bush, I guess in 2001, served 1 term, served another, and now I don't know if he's appointed again, but he's staying on for a 3rd term.
Oh, he has been appointed again. That was going to be
so a 3rd term. So he has been appointed.
President Obama appointed him. I think it was a great selection.
But it's unprecedented. I mean, maybe you're not a student of it, but you follow this. I can't think of another case in which somebody has been a U.S. attorney for a 3rd term.
And I don't know,
especially when it's a different party.
Well, I think that's a tribute to Pat, because I think Pat's detractors would acknowledge that he is equally hard on the Republicans and Democrats, and frankly, that's why I was so proud to work in that office, and that's why this whole idea of sort of partisan politics is really foreign, because you're taught in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you go after all of them hard. Whether they have an R or D by their name is completely irrelevant.
Right, but it is viewed that some people think Patrick Fitzgerald and others, perhaps you working in the U.S. Attorney's Office, don't really understand politics, and you're trying to criminalize politics. What do you say to those folks?
I've heard that criticism. I've heard it of me. I've heard it in the courtroom. In the George Ryan trial, that was the principal defense. This is politics as usual. In the Robert Swords trial, the city of Chicago patronage czar, if you will, that was their principal defense, that this is politics. And part of my argument, not to the jury, but is, this is politics, the Chicago way, if you will, to quote John Cass. But I think it's criminal, it crosses the line, and I think juries...
When do you cross the line? What has to happen to cross the line in this? When does politics become criminal?
In a legal sense, you know, when a public official breaches his duty for private gain, that's where it crosses the line. And I mean, that's what the Seventh Circuit... For private gain. For private gain, for personal gain, for pecuniary interest. I mean, we can use a lot of different terms. When you do it to benefit yourself.
When there's a quid pro quo?
Actually not. I mean, I think that's a step further. It can be something short of a quid pro quo. And I guess, you know, there's this honest services statute that's under siege. Right. And next week, Supreme Court's going to hear argument. But it's an important issue, and it's hard to sort of, you know, address in layman's terms. But a quid pro quo is not required under the law, and I think that's 21st century corruption is not quid pro quo corruption. It's buying a public official over time. And the Ryan case really was about Larry Warner, his close friend, over time buying George Ryan with a series of undisclosed financial benefits, never one for one. In other words, George Ryan giving out a contract and Larry Warner paying a bribe, which would be the quid pro quo, but over a 6, 8, 10-year period, Larry Warner providing financial pecuniary benefits to George Ryan and his family, and then George Ryan steering and inserting Larry Warner into valuable contracts and leases of his governmental office.
So you're saying Ryan was really motivated, at least in that instance, not by an attempt to maximize his political power. There was an attempt to exploit his political power in terms of personal gain for Ryan and his family in terms of monetary benefits?
I think that's fair. I mean, those situations, his Larry Warner relationship wasn't a political, I mean, Larry Warner wasn't a Tony Rezko bundler fundraiser for George Ryan. He did contribute money, but he wasn't a guy who was raising bundles of money for George Ryan. There was a core friendship there, but it was also a friendship that was rooted in back-scratching, financial back-scratching on both sides.
But there were other things in the Secretary of State's office when George Ryan was Secretary of State. That was a matter, was it not, of having licenses, selling licenses essentially, using that bribe money to be channeled into campaign contributions to help George Ryan. Some would, maybe you did characterize that as a criminal enterprise.
Well, my introduction, and this, going back to your question about being a student of politics, my introduction into pay-to-play politics in Illinois was this licenses for bribe stuff, that I started out as a fairly young prosecutor seeing what was garden variety corruption, people walking into the Secretary of State's office with $1,000 and basically buying a truck license, a CDL, commercial driver's license. And that was replicated hundreds, if not thousands of times. And one question we began to ask is, if this is so systemic within the Secretary of State's office, is it being condoned, approved at the higher levels? And that's really where we started looking.
And you concluded it was.
I think we proved it was.
Proved it was, and proved that Guzman was one of the people who bought one of these licenses.
Right.
Later, he didn't understand, it's alleged, and maybe you proved that he didn't understand people trying to tell him he had something that was falling off his truck. One reason perhaps was he didn't speak English. He perhaps was able to pass the test even though he didn't speak English because it was a bribe, and 6 people died as a result of that, right?
I think that's
the Willis family kids.
The Scott Willis, who was a member of the Reform Commission, has become a good friend because of this experience, is truly, in my view, a victim of the culture of corruption. I don't blame it on George Ryan, but yes, Ricardo Guzman bought a license for $1,000. We proved that. The incident that you suggested in terms of the English language, I think, was an issue. We didn't prove that in court, but I think that was an issue. A part of his truck drops, the Willis van driving behind it punctures the gas tank, 6 kids die. I think what's important is not just the bribe, but the intervening. There was a guy at home that night watching this incident where the news was reporting about this horrific inferno that occurred after the accident. He attempted to investigate. He wanted to go to Wisconsin to talk to Guzman because he saw Guzman had an Illinois CDL, commercial driver's license. He was told by Dean Bauer, George Ryan's hand-picked Inspector General, don't go there, don't do that. The case was closed. We later found a smoking gun document that showed that there was a specific effort to stop that investigation. I do start putting that on the upper echelons of the Secretary of State's office. We also found another smoking gun memo where Scott Fawell, George Ryan's chief of staff, basically told George Ryan in '94, a month after this accident, not in relation to the accident, but we want to have these inspectors stop asking questions about fundraising tickets, stop investigating our friends. And George Ryan approved a gutting of that office. That played out in the Ryan trial. Those are situations, again, this culture of corruption where it goes from garden variety $1,000 bribes, and you really show how it got kicked up the chain, and ultimately there was accountability to George Ryan for that actions.
All right, now I know the investigation of Rod Blagojevich, at least most of it probably took place when you weren't in the U.S. Attorney's office, but you read about these things, you talk to people.
No question.
Is this just a natural next step from George Ryan to Governor Rod Blagojevich to saying, hey, I got this Senate seat appointment, it's incredibly powerful. Blagojevich thinks to himself, look, when the president hands out ambassadorships, he hands them out to people who give a lot of money. What's the difference? I'll hand out the Senate seat to people who give money and to my future campaign. I mean, we're not going to prosecute, Patrick Fitzgerald's not going to prosecute Barack Obama for rewarding people who gave a lot of money with an ambassadorship. He's not going to prosecute Barack Obama for that, right?
Well,
I mean, just answer that question. He's not going to prosecute Barack Obama for that, is he?
Of course not.
Of course not. So what is the difference here with Rod Blagojevich in the same way making an appointment and discussing apparently in the same conversation, oh yeah, what can you think folks do? I mean, if I come in, just hypothetically, and I'm a congressman and I say to Rod Blagojevich when he was governor, excuse me, well, I'm certainly interested in this, and I think we can raise money for you when it comes time for your re-election. And Rod says, that's fine, and he talks more about it, and the congressman also says, and, you know, it would be great to be considered, a real honor to be considered for the Senate seat because I have all these attributes that you want. And they walk out. Has the law been violated there?
You know, that's a gray area, and I hesitate not because I'm afraid to answer a tough question, but I think that's a gray area. I think, you know, there is stuff that goes on in politics all the time where big campaign contributors are rewarded. A big question legally is, you know, was that a quid pro quo and was it discussed sort of contemporaneously? If I raise the money and then I come back and I see a list of my fundraisers, I'm an elected official, and I start rewarding them, that's not a crime. I think, you know, the real practical point here, Jeff, when you're on tape saying I have something that is golden and I'm going to barter for it, that's quid pro quo sort of language.
Which is what we've read in the papers that Rod Blagojevich has said. And maybe some of us have heard those tapes.
Correct. I haven't heard them, yeah. But maybe the thief who burglarized his office has got them and read them. But, you know, the words matter and the timing matters. And I think part of it is to talk about this in a criminal. My biggest problem with the whole Blagojevich thing and the jury, I'm a firm believer in the jury system. We'll have to wait and see. I think there's an argument that this case is going to be not as easy as a lot of people think. What really bothers me as a citizen is if you overlay the George Ryan chronology, he was indicted in 03, he was convicted in 06, he was sentenced in 07, went to jail in 08. If you overlay that chronology with the allegations of the Blagojevich case, they match perfectly. And what does that mean? It means to me this idea of deterrence, which is a big reason I worked as a prosecutor, is you make a case so that you stop the next guy from doing it. He allegedly, if not did the same stuff as George Ryan, took it up a notch when he saw this stuff playing out before him. That is, even by Illinois standards, that boggles my mind. That the guy, the successor, could look at what's happening to his predecessor in real time as he is allegedly selling the office.
So the critics of the Illinois Reform Contribution and the people who believe in the efficacy, as apparently you do, of campaign contribution limits would say, you just made their case. The problem is not money. The problem is not donations. The problem is people who are crooks getting into office and making backroom deals. And apparently those folks are undeterred because they're arrogant and they think they can get away with it. And if you put a campaign contribution limits, as the current law does, of $5,000 for individuals, $10,000 for unions and companies, and what is it, 50,000, 5,000 for individuals, 10,000 for unions and companies, and what's 50,000 for? I can't remember.
There's nothing for 50,000
okay.
in
but
the
anyway,
current law.
So if you put those limits, it's not going to really do much. Because people who want to give more than that, and those things are pretty generous, they're going to find a way. On the federal side, they came up with 527s to circumvent the federal laws. 35 years of campaign finance reform in the federal system, and do you think it's working? Do you think, you know, Abramoff would be an example of it working? You see the point?
Of course I see the point, and I'll start, Jeff, with my principal point is you can't legislate morality, and I think the first and foremost thing is we need good people in office. But I do think limits have a role in Illinois, and here's my argument most pointedly. George Ryan raised 20 contributions of $25,000 or more, 20. I think Jim Edgar did 8. Rod Blagojevich did 425 of $25,000 or more. I do think big money is more susceptible to the quid pro quo. I mean, this guy Aliata in the Resco case was, according to the testimony, went to an area, a home, and exchanged a $25,000 check and basically for a promise that he was going to get a board and commission seat.
With Resco there, and
with Resco there.
With the governor there, right?
Correct.
And the governor said when he saw that check, do we have a job for this guy?
Exactly right.
At least that's how we understand it. We haven't.
No, I mean, that played out at the testimony.
That was the testimony of the Resco trial.
Okay. Whether the jury will believe that or not in Blagojevich, we'll see. But my point is, if Aliata comes with a $2,000 check, Jeff, or $2,500 check, I don't think Blagojevich's response is, do we have a job for this guy? In other words, there is something about the big money. You don't give $25,000 or $50,000 unless you're a family member, unless you want something. And I think so. It's a real sort of starting point.
They still do it. The real thing, and there's power in government. This guy wanted that job. That job wasn't going to pay him a great deal, but there's a tremendous power to that job, and he could benefit himself if you know. So even if he'd paid $5,000 for that job, what it means is people got to gather more contributions. And people usually say incumbents have the advantage. If you have a challenger who wants to come in, look, Gene McCarthy, you're too young to remember this, but some of us are. And remember Gene McCarthy ran in 1968, and he basically knocked LBJ off the ballot. You know why he was able to do that? Because he could get, I think it was Stuart Mott, one of the heirs of the GM, of Ford or General Motors, somebody like that, wanted to give a lot of money to Gene McCarthy to stop the war. And there was no limits. So Gene McCarthy knocked off LBJ because we didn't have campaign finance reform.
Hey, look,
you understand that?
I understand it. And
we might still be fighting the war in Vietnam, and LBJ might have been president if we had campaign finance reform. Does that give you some pause that maybe, although your intentions are good, the effect may be bad?
It would if I suggest that this is some talismanic solution, that it's the cure-all. And I've always said with campaign finance, there should be a big asterisk. We're talking about first levels of making it harder for the bad guys to do it. I think if you talk to candidates who are run at the federal level, some of them I think welcome the regime where they got to do it in $2,500 at crack. I mean, they have to take more time to do it, but I just don't think typically you're buying a candidate for $2,500. I think for $25 and $50 you are. You know, but just to be clear, caps are a first step. I'm a big believer, and again, I have no idea where you're at on this, but I'm a big believer that we have to look at a public finance option for candidates. I think there's so many good people who would like to run for office who can't get off the dime because...
We had one on the federal level, and Barack Obama bypassed it. If you know Barack, I know Barack, you probably think highly of him, you think of him as a reformer. If that guy's going to bypass the public finance, who's going to take it?
Well, but Barack Obama, let's also be honest, is an exception. I mean, he
could make more, and it was to his advantage, and so he just said, "The hell with it." I mean, he didn't use that phrasing, but that was it. Basically,
it was clearly a decision that he made because of what was in his political self-interest. But I guess what I'm saying is, he caught magic in a bottle, and I think to use him as the example for the public finance would have no purpose. What we really have to look at, Jeff, our judges, our state and rep. How do we get people to have a sense of independence? You talked about Speaker Madigan or pick your Republican leader. How do we get folks to run with a sense of independence? Not that they can't be a partisan Democrat or partisan Republican, but that they will not follow along like sheep. And
well, I don't know, because you had a lot of independents involved in the Illinois Reform Commission.
We did.
You were working with Cindy Canary. You were working with Change Illinois. They ended up supporting that legislation that passed. You didn't, right?
I personally do not support that.
You don't support that?
No, I don't.
Because they didn't have limits on the leaders, right?
Because I think just to play out this
that slush fund we talked about at the beginning of the show, that $25 million slush fund, it still exists. Cindy Canary said, "Oh, I don't care, we got something."
Oh, and again,
Change Illinois said, "I don't care, we got something."
I have a lot of respect
Pat
for...
Collins said, "No," right?
I was never asked officially, but
I'm asking you now. You didn't support that, right?
No.
You don't support it?
I did not, I do not.
Okay.
And I do not, and I also would argue, Jeff, that if you put campaign limits in place with everybody, and then the powerful people before the limits, you don't restrict them, you've actually increased their power.
You made it worse.
You have.
That's what the Chicago Tribune said. They don't even support these limits. They buy the argument I was making.
Right.
But on this, they said if you're going to do limits, and 50,000 applies to PACs, I forgot that. So if you're going to limit campaign individuals, you're going to limit companies, you're going to limit unions, you're going to limit political action committees, but you're not going to limit Mike Madigan. The Tribune said that's dumb. That's dumb, right? And that's what you're saying.
They write with a point, and I would agree with that logic. You cannot. turn down the volume for everybody else, but allow the powerful people their same mechanism. It makes no sense to me.
All right. Going forward to Rod Blagojevich, we talked about that a little before. You talked about it being a gray area. I gave a hypothetical. Maybe what happened is less gray. Maybe there was a congressman who came in and said, like to be a senator, and he said, can you raise money? And they said, I could. If that happened and that's on wiretap, that's less gray, right?
It is, and
that's a quid pro quo.
I think that's really close. And your last point about, and it's on wiretap, this makes a big difference. If something is said on tape versus two people would testify about it, the prosecutor would take the tape. The gray area, the close to gray area cases, if it's on tape, you'll bring the case if you're the prosecutor. If it's people testifying and looking at the contributions lining up, you don't bring that case.
So you wanted the state to have that power, that kind of wiretap, and the Illinois Reform Commission wanted that. Again, the legislature said no, right?
Yeah,
not a part of the reform package.
Not at all. And
another reason why you didn't sign on to that, right?
Yes, I mean to me, Jeff,
right.
I talk about game-changing reform, and that was a big one, because you can't have the feds have the tool and the state doesn't have the tool. We do have a wiretap statute. I mean, those civil libertarians out there,
right.
We have a wiretap statute. Okay, so we're talking about, does it apply to extortion and bribery?
It doesn't.
It does not.
In the state?
It doesn't.
On the federal level, it does.
It does. It makes no sense to me.
All right, makes sense to Speaker Mike Madigan, right? Makes sense to Senate President John Cullerton, right?
And I wouldn't just limit to those guys. I mean, the people in Springfield, we were almost laughed out of Springfield with that suggestion.
All right, so nothing's changed. As people go to the polls on February 2nd, there will be limitations in the primary election on how much these leaders can spend, but not in the general election. And they're just laughing because everybody knows mostly they stay out of primaries, right?
Yeah, could I make another laugh joke too? I mean, the fact that we're going to the polls on February 2nd, I mean, think about that.
Should be June.
It should be June.
Hold that thought. We're going to continue to speak as the credits roll, but I very much want to thank Patrick Collins. Patrick, thank you so much for coming.
Good to be here.
He, of course, is a former prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He is now a partner on partner at Perkins Cooey. He heads up the white collar criminal.
We call it investigations in white collar. Really,
right.
The investigations part of it is my principal practice, being hired by companies to do investigations.
And you were chair of the Illinois Reform Commission. So you had your feel. Maybe that wasn't quite politics, but it was. Seriously, a lot of people have said you would make a good candidate for governor in 2014. Would you consider it?
Not right now.
Would you run as a Republican or as a Democrat?
I will tell you this: if I ever ran, I'd run as an independent.
Is that right? So you would not run as a
if I ever ran, as a big if.
But you wouldn't run as a member of one of the major parties.
I don't think so. But I don't have any plans to run.
Well, if you feel so strongly about this and you see it wasn't happening, don't you think you need a strong, charismatic leader to be the spokesperson for reform? Isn't it almost your duty, your obligation as a citizen?
Jeff, I've been a public servant for 12 years. I worked my butt off for the people for 12 years. I got a young family, 4 kids, under 8. I got mouths to feed. That's my principal function.
When you take care of that, I understand, but when you take care of that.
Both parties have screwed up big time, in my view. Both Republican and Democratic parties at the state level have screwed up big time.
Is Pat Quinn getting it right as governor of the state of Illinois?
I'm honored that Pat Quinn picked me. I'm honored that Pat Quinn let us do a report.
But he's supporting the legislation that you don't support. He's going to sign it almost surely.